Joe Rogan, in conversation with comedian Dave Smith, said something offhandedly about advice that he would give to a young person considering whether or not to get vaccinated for COVID. Actually, maybe, Zach, we should show that clip.
Yeah, I think for the most part, it's safe to get vaccinated. I do. But if you're like 21 years old and you say to me, should I get vaccinated? I go, no.
Yeah.
Are you healthy? Are you a healthy person? Like, look, don't do anything stupid, but you should take care of yourself. You should, if you're a healthy person and you're exercising all the time and you're young and you're eating well, and like, I don't think you need to worry about this.
Now, Rogan was careful not to say that all people shouldn't be vaccinated.
Okay,
but he
so
did
that was Joe Rogan, and what he said is that if he was advising a healthy person, something like 21 years of age, that he would likely advise them not to get the vaccine. And the world jumped on Joe and, of course, mocked him and made fun of him for not having the expertise to say such things. And my sense was, although I didn't think Joe gave a complete analysis here of why what he suggested might make sense, I actually didn't think that the advice he was giving was so terrible because, of course, there are all sorts of questions that do suggest we should at least be thinking twice about advising young people to get the vaccine. So in other words, what we had Fauci weighing in and saying that, of course, young people should get the vaccine. And then Fauci, although I don't think Joe was wrong, Fauci said some things that were true. What he said was that Joe's analysis seemed to pay attention only to one's personal well-being, and that he was not paying proper attention to the fact that a healthy person who gets COVID and suffers from it only very little may be exposing other people to the virus, and they may suffer greatly and in fact could die from it, and that is a reason to get the vaccine. And in isolation, that analysis is probably right, but that analysis does not exist in isolation. And so I wanted to take some time to sort through the various things that contribute to the analysis of who should get vaccinated. But you had a point.
Yeah, I mean, there are many points to be made here, and I know we're going to spend some time talking about this, but just to finish up your sort of reporting of what it is that you're responding to here, Joe did clarify with an additional statement after Fauci said what he said, and it's too long, I think, to play here. It's 5-7 minute thing, but he exactly repeated the point that you just made, which is this is an individual level analysis, not a population level analysis, and he was not presuming to make the population level analysis. Those aren't his words, but that's what he was saying.
No, I saw the retraction or the walking back. It wasn't really a retraction, but in any case, I was a little bit concerned about it because my sense is, Joe is a layperson. He was having a discussion that did not pretend to be authoritative in this regard, and so it was incomplete, but it wasn't pretending to be a complete analysis. And the fact is, I thought Joe was on much stronger ground in light of what we've been talking about on DarkHorse for so many months now, which is the huge unknowns that surround vaccine safety long term. And so the analysis about whether or not a young person should get vaccinated should center on some kind of balance between, yes, the possibility that a young person could get COVID, could pass it on to other people, but also the possibility that a young person could get a vaccine and then suffer hazards down the road. And that analysis does not suggest that this is clear-cut in Fauci's direction. That is my water, kitty cat. That this is clear-cut in Fauci's direction and against Joe. So I thought, I certainly understood that Joe was in a bad position, that in effect somebody, without a credential was vulnerable to the world piling on that he was giving medical advice that he wasn't in a position to give, but he wasn't pretending to be a medical authority.
So before we start walking through some of what we do see with regard to the data, the WAPO, the Washington Post, joined the fray with this piece. You can show my screen just for me to read the headline, Zach. Joe Rogan is using his wildly popular podcast to question vaccines. Experts are fighting back. So that's one of the main news outlets in the United States here, and I'm just going to read from my screen, Zach, so you don't have to show it again. two paragraphs near the end of this WAPO article dated April 29th. So this is 2 days ago. Misinformation coming from someone like Rogan continues to perpetuate doubt, said Kalina Koltai, a vaccine misinformation researcher at the University of Washington. A lot of young adults follow him, and he's encouraging people to have hesitation. Koltai pointed out that, quote, no one is getting all of their information from Joe Rogan, but when his comments clash with what experts tell us, it helps muddy the waters. Quote, hearing these conflicting messages from someone you might trust and someone you might agree with typically, it can potentially cause you to be concerned, she said. Quote, oftentimes it just ends up confusing people and making them not sure what to do. So that language struck me as so anti-scientific and just antithetical to skepticism that although I don't tend to do this, certainly not on air, I went and figured out who this person was who was being trotted out as the expert who is saying that that Rogan doesn't know what he's doing. She's a postdoc at UW, at University of Washington, with a PhD in, quote, information studies. She's not a scientist. And she states on the website, the university website, that she researches, quote, decision-making with a focus on when people dissent from the scientific mainstream. That has nothing to do with science. And that actually may exactly be training that she has that allows her to speak as if expert here that runs exactly opposed to what the scientific method is. She may well know what information is and what it looks like when people start to disbelieve things that most people believe to be true. But disbelieving what most people believe to be true does not mean that those people are themselves wrong. I don't think that I see nothing, and I spent just a little bit of time with her website, indicating that she actually understands what the scientific method is. And I'm not saying that, if I put her and Joe Rogan in a room and asked them to define the scientific method, that one of them would obviously come out on top. But I feel like Joe is personifying on a regular basis a skeptical approach to the world in which he is using largely his intuition rather than formal training to try to navigate. And he is not accepting the basis of authority. And, we are being told in response, how dare you listen to this man? You must trust the authorities. And the authorities are over and over and over again demonstrating that they actually don't even know what science is.
Right. In fact, the entire idea of taking science and marshaling against those who would challenge it is the height of unscientific, right?
Exactly.
Everything we now believe started out as heterodoxy, right? And it comes to be orthodoxy because it withstands test and we find out how it works. But the point is, do you really think that we're in a place where you can freeze that process now? It's like it's God-given, right? This is a religious perspective. The scientific perspective is, we don't know what of the things that we believe today we will come to discover are false tomorrow, right? But we understand that that is the pattern. Anybody who's studied the history of science knows that. And so, yes, the idea that departing from heterodoxy is evidence of something having gone awry or somebody overstepping the bounds or something is nonsense on its face.
Now, to steelman, say, Fauci's and the so-called experts' position here, this does come down to, is this an individual versus a population level analysis? Because the assessment that, say, Joe was doing and that we have largely been doing when we have talked about these things here are, is this the right decision for you? Is this safe for individuals? And the epidemiological question is a different kind of analysis. What amount of protection does a population need so that we can safely go back to normal? And what does safe mean, and what is your tolerance for risk? And all of these things need to be wrapped up into that. But that is a different kind of analysis.
Well, it is a wholly different kind of analysis. But my claim is that we are actually not in a position where anybody gets to wave that at you. And the reason they don't get to wave that at you is because they have botched their side of a contract, right?
Yeah.
And believe me, I'm always in this weird position where I have to explain what my own values would mean if we were navigating this the way I think we should be navigating this. We would be having a thoroughly open discussion in which heterodoxy was absolutely welcome and people were able to level whatever challenges and be protected in so doing. And so we would have a really good understanding of what the risks of these vaccines are, what the risks from COVID are, what the uncertainties about both are. And then once we had done that analysis, once people had hashed out the question of how do we compare the risks that come from COVID with the risks that come from vaccines based on unknown technologies accelerated through this process. Once we had done that, I do feel like society has the right to coerce people to take their share of the risk to shut down a pandemic that threatens us all. But we aren't remotely in that world. And I don't want to be told by any of these people who are busy participating in obscuring those risks that I or my children or people who know better have to take these risks, because that's simply part of our duty to society. Society has fallen down on its side of this equation. And of course, the irony of ironies is that Fauci is the one telling us what our duty to society is, right? Because Fauci played a role in restarting gain-of-function research, which it is ever clear may have played a decisive role in creating the pandemic. So, frankly, I'm sure that was an honest mistake on his part. But the fact is, some people, like Fauci, used to believe gain-of-function research was safe enough that we could engage in it and not put the world at risk of a major pandemic. It's becoming clear that wasn't the case, right? Whether or not this pandemic is the result of a laboratory escape, it is clear that things escape laboratories routinely, and gain-of-function research is perfectly capable of creating a nightmare virus. And so, did it happen here? We have yet to find out. But wow, is Fauci not in a position to wag his finger at the rest of us?
Yeah.
Also, there's the mask fiasco where he, lied about whether or not masks were valuable, and then later acknowledged that that's what he had done. So he's not in a position to do it. But if I can just reset the discussion just slightly, I want to point out that there is a hierarchy of categories, and that all of these discussions should recognize that we are being asked to move from one category to another. So actually, Zach, could you put up the risk categories for the living that I sent you?
I have not seen this.
My claim...
Actually, can you give me one of your copies?
Sure. In fact, that is your copy. I printed it for you. So my claim is that there are 4 large categories that you could be in. The first one is you haven't had COVID or a vaccine. That's the category you and I are in. And that one carries no risk in and of itself, and an unknown ongoing susceptibility to COVID risk. That is to say, the risk is 0 of not having a vaccine and not having COVID, and the risk of getting COVID is unknown.
So this is very unclear to me. I think I know what you mean, but obviously if you're not protected from COVID, as we have said many, many times, is a dangerous disease.
Oh, yes.
There's no risk. I mean, there's no risk.
No, well, I think this will become clear as we go through it. The point is, you're not having a risk from either COVID or the vaccine if you haven't had either. You do have a risk of getting COVID, which will be destructive, and it is a very dangerous disease, but you don't have any risk going forward from your status because you're basically, you haven't been affected by either yet.
Yeah.
Second category is you have had the vaccine, but you have not had COVID, right? Now, presumably that has a small short-term risk, although I don't think we have a good sense of how small that short-term risk is. And there are certainly a tremendous number of anecdotes, even just among the people that we know who have gotten the vaccine, of all kinds of pathologies that have shown up. And the long-term risk in category 2, that is to say you have had the vaccine, but you have not had COVID, is entirely unknown. We don't know what the long-term risk of these vaccines is. The third category is you've had COVID, but no vaccine. There is substantial short-term risk from having had COVID, tissue damage, as we have covered many times. And the long-term risk from having had COVID is unknown, but likely substantial. That is to say, tissue damage has an ongoing cost. And then there is category 4, where you've had both. And I've had to divide this into 2 because the order in which you've had COVID and the vaccine probably makes a big difference. If you had COVID first, then there might even be a benefit to those who have had what's called long-haul COVID, right? There is some evidence that...
There's some anecdotal stories of people recovering from long-haul COVID after getting a vaccine.
Right, which I should say in passing, I think implies that long-haul COVID is an autoimmune disorder, right? Because if you have autoimmunity, your immune system is now attacking your tissues, having cleared COVID, but it still thinks there's something there, and it's attacking you, and then you flood the system with spike protein generated by the vaccine, that may occupy the cells that are otherwise attacking your tissue and give you relief. Okay. And then category 4, you've had both, but you had the vaccine first. Then you will have greatly reduced COVID risk. That is to say, we believe from the data we have seen that COVID is less severe if you get it having had the vaccine. And that means
You're less likely to get it, and it's less likely to be severe if you do get it.
right.
Yep.
And it's less likely to be severe. So you probably have a reduced long-term risk, though we don't know that for sure either.
Yep.
Okay. My basic point here.
So I will say, I think it's, I think it's guaranteed that that screenshot is going to be taken out of context of the conversation. And the idea that haven't had COVID or vaccine is no risk is nothing that you actually believe. And that is, I wish you hadn't written that on this piece of paper, because that's not what you mean.
Yeah, I absolutely do not. As we have said many times, and as I have said to Joe Rogan, I believe on his program, the fact that COVID is less deadly than we once thought is misleading people. It's a very dangerous disease on the basis of tissue damage, and it's robbing people of years of life in all probability. If everything we understand about physiology and tissue repair is true, then the significant damage it does is very harmful, and you definitely want to avoid COVID. That said, we are in a situation where, without the ability to know what the long-term consequences are, you do have to ask a question about for whom is it worth taking the risk of the vaccine? And that's the thing that Joe was addressing. So
before we go to the Economist thing,
sure.
which you just sprung on me at the very last minute and I have not seen yet. So can we just show the CDC table, since that is something that is easy to interpret and it's not interactive? So Zach, you can show my screen, which both Bret and I are familiar with already. This is a chart at the CDC, updated February 18th of this year, risk for COVID-19 infection, hospitalization, and death by age group. So they've split age groups into several of different spans, which is weird. Right, 0 to 4 years old, 5 to 17 years old, 18 to 29, 30 to 39, 40 to 49, 50 to 64. Why they expand the number of years as we're getting older and as the risk is getting higher, I don't understand. Like this is a strange table. And then there's 3 categories: cases, risk of getting it in each of those age groups, risk of hospitalization in each of those age groups, and risk of death in each of those age groups. And as we've said many, many times, focusing only on death is not the right way to think about the true risk of this disease. And for the purposes of this table, they have used the 5 to 17-year-old category, which is too broad, but the 5 to 17-year-old category as the reference group. So that's that's default. That's 1. And what you can see for those listening only and not watching is that, interestingly, cases increase the older you get above 17 years old until you get to 65 to 84-year-olds, and then it's down again. So I don't know what that's about.
Well, it could be that the cohort is small. I don't know what the methodology was.
Well, it's ratios. It's not absolute numbers. But the two other metrics that they're using here are hospitalizations and deaths, which follow exactly what we all know. Everyone who hasn't been under a log for the last 14 months knows, which is that the older you get, the greater your risk of hospitalization and the greater your risk of death. With, for instance, in just for hospitalizations, 18 to 29-year-olds are 6 times at risk as 5 to 17-year-olds. The next age group is 10 times, then 15, then 25, 40, 65, 95 times the risk for 85 plus year old people. And it's for death, it's 8,700 times the risk. But before you say something here, what is also interesting is that the very young, 0 to 4-year-olds, actually have a higher risk of hospitalization and death from COVID, only twice, but then do the 5 to 17-year-olds.
Okay, but I have to say, this chart has me jumping out of my skin. I cannot think of a justification for having put it together this way. It is absolutely misleading and in a direction that we are now being scolded with. And I believe it, I cannot establish it could just be ineptitude that caused this, but the idea of these broad categories in a case where you have not even a linear relationship in which the hazard goes up with time, but an exponential relationship. The idea of grouping 5 to 17-year-olds, making them the reference category, and then deriving an 8,700 times risk from that reference category. That's basically using the fact in this is a scary table, but in fact, what it says is that the number is very, very tiny in that 5 to 17-year group.
Yeah.
And the fact is 5 to 17 years is a weird jump to have made. So
I don't know what's misleading here.
back when we were in graduate school,
Yeah.
I did a joke survey. You may or may not recall. We were in the field. And my joke survey
in Costa Rica or
in
something.
Costa Rica,
Mhm.
what I did was I did a survey to see what the density of non-avian dinosaurs was per hectare in a study area. And the way I did my study was I had categories. I would count the number of non-avian dinosaurs, and I had a category. If a hectare had 0 to 5, I ranked it as 2.5, etc. Right? And then it turned out that there were an average of 2.5 dinosaurs per hectare.
I mean, that's hilarious, but I don't see how that like this table chart, I don't even know what to call it. This table, yes, lumps 5 to 17-year-old people, and we know that we can get greater granularity than that. And the 5 to 10-year-olds are at significantly lower risk than the 10 to 15-year-olds, for instance. But there's nothing that goes counter to those numbers here. We've just in this case, we've just got a collapse of two categories that are very, very similar.
A sophisticated person can figure out what this chart does and doesn't mean. And what it does mean is that they've effectively done surgery with an axe, right? Those large categories don't have to be there. It doesn't add clarity. And in fact, you can see if you go to The Economist as an alternative way of viewing this kind of information.
So I'm not vouching for this because I have not seen it. You just literally sent it to me.
So scroll up.
Zach, you can show it, honey.
Okay, that chart.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this chart gives you enough granularity to see what the risks are, right?
So some people are just listening. What are we looking at?
What we are looking at is scroll back out.
Scroll back out. You can
estimated COVID-19 risk if diagnosed in the United States, and what we have is a curve. It's not perfectly smooth, but we have a curve, and you can see risks are extremely low.
Mm-hmm.
You can switch between males and females, right? So at 21, go to 21, you have about a 1% risk of hospitalization. So this is the exact number that Joe Rogan was talking about.
For men, and it's way low. It's even
way
lower
for females.
Women. Yep.
And then you can move by age, and you also can add medical conditions as you want. Interestingly, I think I added asthma just to see how it worked, and the numbers drop. I've also heard that. It's a paradoxical result.
This seems cool. It does not allow us. This has hospitalizations and deaths, and it doesn't say how likely you are to get the thing in the first place.
Right.
The case rate, which is what the CDC graph table did show.
Right, but that CDC table creates, I believe, a false impression on the basis of making giant categories for no reason. My point here is that the granularity of this allows you to see how steeply your risks go up. And so if we're going to wag our fingers at Joe Rogan, we need to understand that what he said requires us to take the condition of a healthy 21-year-old, right, to give them an unknown risk from a unproven technology. At that age, not only are they taking a risk of an unproven technology, but their lives are going to be longer. And so the time in which something can go wrong is that much greater, as we've discussed here on DarkHorse multiple times. Mm-hmm. And so the point is, all Joe said was that if he was advising a person at 21 whether or not to take the vaccine, if they were healthy and they weren't going to take stupid risks, he would advise against it. And whether or not that is the right advice, it is certainly fair for a person or that person's parent. I mean, I guess a 21-year-old is old enough to decide for themselves, but that person has to be able to judge what is the risk that I'm going to do myself harm with a vaccine that I would not suffer if I stayed away from the vaccine. And so that is a reasonable question for us to ask. And again, if some panel that was completely immune from perverse incentives and well positioned to see all of the data and to look at the patterns was to say, actually, we don't know what your long-term risk is, but here are the reasons we think it's low. Here are the risks we think you suffer, of both getting COVID, and if you get COVID, what the consequences are. And here's why this is either better for you, or if it's somewhat worse for you, it is a manageable level of worse, and the advantage that comes to society of nobody being downstream of you who gets the disease, which, mind you, isn't even the case. It's not like these vaccines are perfectly effective at keeping people from getting and passing on COVID, though they do appear somewhat effective. So it is a reasonable question to ask.
Of course it is. It is, as you just alluded to, it is constantly a struggle to get the conversation to toggle explicitly between individual level decisions and what is best for society. And, broadly speaking, the people on the political right tend to focus on individual level rights, and the people on the political left tend to focus on population level rights. And, we have been arguing, as people who have long been on the left, that of course we need to be doing both, that we have responsibilities to each other. Having gotten rights from society, we have responsibilities in return, and we also exist as individuals. And what the scientific method is very good at, and what you and I are very good at, is assessing, in this case, individual level risks. And the population level analysis is tougher, and I have yet to see a careful explanation of what is going on to make the recommendations what they are, as opposed to simply let's bludgeon the populace with the sense that if they don't do this, there's something wrong with them, and they simply must. There are plenty of us out here who would like the information and are not interested in simply taking it on someone's authority, especially someone who has reliably demonstrated that their authority is not particularly reliable.
Well, but I think my point goes one step beyond that, which is what we can see of the analysis so far tells us that nobody has the information to balance these concerns, right? If they have it, it's private. We haven't heard it, right?
Well, that's my point, that I want to have access to that information.
Right. It would be great to have access to that information, but knowing that we don't, right? Knowing that what we have is the pretense of vaccines that are safe, when there is at least a large unknown risk of a long-term hazard, and that is not being discussed, we are forced to default into actually protecting our personal well-being. If we haven't been given the information to say, actually, why is it that I as an individual am taking some risk? I'm doing it because collectively we need me to do it. But if I can't calibrate the value and can't calibrate the risk to myself, then I'm justified. And in fact, I would say we've got two liberal things against each other. On the one hand, we've got justifiable focus on collective well-being and having to balance it with individual well-being. But we also have the precautionary principle. And the fact is we are effectively being shamed out of applying the precautionary principle to our own well-being in order to make this all work out. And at the same time, actually, Zach, would you put up the thumbnail for Crystal Ball from the Hill? So this is just one more piece of information in the stream, but Crystal Ball had a very good piece this week on Bill Gates and his insistence that patent protections be maintained, that effectively pharmaceutical company patent protections be maintained in order to keep the flow of resources going, even though that surely means fewer people are going to end up vaccinated. And in fact, her accusation is that Bill is lying, that he claims there are no facilities that could be brought into creating vaccine if the patents were relaxed, so there's no benefit to doing it. And in fact, that is absolutely false. There are apparently. So what we've got on the one hand is business as usual taking place in pharma land, We have public financing of the research that creates these things, and then we have the privatization of the profits, and we don't have a footing as you might get during a war where factories are brought into the national interest and are making weapons or something like that. What we have is the pharmaceutical industry continuing to practice its business as usual, in spite of the fact that it will cost lives if these vaccines are the lifesavers that are being claimed. So we are being told we have to take risks that cannot be calibrated when others are not showing that this is, that all hands on deck moment, and that they are doing the same with their business profits. It just doesn't add up.